The once shimmering stained glass windows are now boarded up. But for nearly 100 years, this building on West Chestnut Street housed the oldest black congregation in our city. Built in 1884 and abandoned since 2002, it is a historic landmark, a 15-minute walk from the Fraser History Museum's doors. Today, there is new hope for the former Quinn Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church. Last May, the National Park Service approved a $1.5 million grant to stabilize the site in order to preserve the amazing history inside, not the least of which being the time when none other than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke at this church in 1961. The story of this church goes back to when Louisville was a frontier town on the banks of the Ohio. In 1838, the congregation moved into its first physical location, a humble room above a stable at 2nd and Main Street. Perhaps because of this, the congregation called itself the Upper Room Church, although it later changed its name to Bethel Church. The church's first pastor was the Reverend David Smith. In the early days of the church, the Reverend Paul Quinn, one of the Reverend Bishops of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, gave an inspiring speech that motivated the city's burgeoning abolitionist movement. The church changed its name to Quinn Chapel, and the next chapter of its central role in this history of the civil rights movement began. In the church's early days, it was known as the Abolitionists' Church, so powerful that enslavers did what they could to forbid the enslaved from visiting it. As part of a network that also included Quaker congregations on the other side of the Ohio, historian Dr. J. Blaine Hudson asserts that it was an integral part of the Underground Railroad and likely the most active congregation to assist freedom seekers in Louisville. The first school to teach black children in Louisville was opened out of this church at the same time. In the 1870s, Quinn Chapel helped organize freedom rides on the local streetcars in order to challenge segregated streetcar lines in the city. This success led to the integration of streetcars across the country and is recognized as one of the first and biggest nonviolent civil rights protests in America. The congregation had quite a legacy behind them before they even set foot in the doors of 912 West Chestnut, where they moved in 1910, according to most sources. It was in this very building that protesters strategized against a 1914 residential segregation ordinance in Louisville. Like the streetcar segregation protest, challenges to this ordinance again made a national impact. 100 years later, the fact that the Supreme Court overturned this ordinance is credited with being one of the few checks that was put on Jim Crow laws in the first half of the 20th century. And the efforts to halt this ordinance directly led to the founding of Louisville's NAACP chapter. In 1939, activist educator Mary McLeod Bethune spoke at a conference at Quinn Chapel. In late April 1961, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary invited Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to speak about the injustice of segregation in public accommodations. As part of this visit, he spoke to an audience of over 1,000 to commend local high school students for their efforts to protest segregation. He returned to the church as Nobel Peace Prize winner in May 1967 and spoke out against another housing segregation bill. This time, it was on the invitation of his brother, Dr. A.D. King, who led the nearby Zion Baptist Church beginning in 1964. Earlier that week, Muhammad Ali had also spoken at Quinn Chapel against the rejection of open housing in Louisville. Martin Luther King Jr. led a march that started at Quinn Chapel and went down Broadway and back again. 40 years later, the Quinn Chapel congregation settled into a new home at 1901 West Muhammad Ali Boulevard. The old church building was in desperate need of repair and was sold to the YMCA next door. Finally, with this new grant and national recognition, the city is hopeful that the building will be restored to its former glory, a place where some of the most important history in our city took place. The story of Quinn Chapel can remind us of one very important thing: the civil rights movement and the struggle for freedom and equality for all are an ongoing movement that has been part of the American story from its very beginning. And this movement has led many brave leaders who risked it all. And for some of them, Quinn Chapel provided a platform, a starting point, and a place to celebrate victories gained.